Part 1: Introduction and Historical Context. The phrase "dark night of the soul" evokes a haunting sense of loss, despair, and yet, paradoxically, hope. It whispers of a sacred silence, a divine abandonment that somehow leads us closer to God, to truth, to transformation. But where did this idea begin? How did a single 16th century mystic capture one of the most profound spiritual struggles in a few poetic verses? And why does it still echo through modern spirituality today? To understand the journey, we must first travel back to 16th century Spain, a time of religious intensity, persecution, and mysticism. A time when a man named Juan de Yepes, later known as Saint John of the Cross, would shape the spiritual landscape of the world forever. Spain in the 1500s was gripped by a deep religious fervor. The Spanish Inquisition loomed over theological dissent. The Catholic Church was powerful, strict, and ever watchful. Yet within the tension, a flowering of Christian mysticism quietly bloomed, marked by visions, ecstatic experiences, and a longing for union with the divine. It was in this rich yet oppressive context that Juan de Yepes was born in 1542 into poverty. As a child, he endured hardship, hunger, and the untimely death of his father. These early experiences with suffering laid the groundwork for his inner sensitivity and spiritual depth. John joined the Carmelite order in his youth, but the opulence and comfort of many monasteries disturbed him. It was during this time he met Teresa of Avila, a fierce reformer of the Carmelite tradition. Teresa sought a return to simplicity, prayer, and spiritual discipline. Together, Teresa and John initiated what would become the Discalced Carmelite Reform, a movement that emphasized poverty, silence, solitude, and a deeper mystical life. But this reform wasn't welcomed by everyone. The backlash would plunge John into his own dark night, both literally and spiritually. In 1577, John was imprisoned by members of his own Carmelite order who opposed the reform. He was locked in a small and dark cell barely large enough to lie down. For 9 months, he endured cold, hunger, disease, and spiritual desolation. But it was in this crucible of suffering that he experienced his most powerful revelations. It was here that he began composing the verses that would become the Dark Night of the Soul, written first as a poem and later expanded into a theological treatise. In darkness and secure by the secret ladder, disguised, the delight in darkness and concealment. My house being now at rest, Saint John of the Cross. This wasn't just poetry, it was the soul's cry for union with the divine. Saint John's writings are structured in layers: first, a poem, then a detailed commentary unpacking each mystical line. He explains that the dark night is not depression or punishment, but a necessary purification. It is a stage of the contemplative journey, where God removes all spiritual consolations, all egoic supports, and draws the soul through divine darkness to prepare it for union with God. John breaks the dark night into 2 stages. The night of the senses, where we lose pleasure in the external world and even in spiritual practices. The night of the spirit, a deeper stripping away of identity, control, and even perceived connection to God. Each phase is excruciating, but for John, it is essential. Part 2: The spread of the concept through history. Saint John of the Cross passed away in 1591, largely unrecognized by the mainstream church. His writings were not widely distributed during his lifetime. Yet, after his death, something remarkable happened. His works began circulating in monastic and mystical circles, especially in Spain and Italy. His teachings resonated with monks, nuns, hermits, those who had chosen the path of solitude and contemplation. They saw their own spiritual trials reflected in his poetry. Over time, John was canonized in 1726 and named a Doctor of the Church in 1926, cementing his influence within Catholic theology. But his message would not stay within monastery walls for long. The 17th and 18th centuries saw a rise in interest in Christian mysticism throughout Europe. Figures such as Madame Guyon in France and Jacob Boehme in Germany began speaking of interior purification, union with God, and divine darkness. Many of them referenced the dark night either directly or indirectly. Even though Protestantism had broken away from Catholic traditions, mystics within the Protestant world, like Boehme and later William Law, found deep kinship with St. John's experiences. By the 18th century, the idea of the soul's dark night was no longer just a Catholic idea. It had become a shared spiritual language for anyone walking through divine silence or spiritual desolation. As the Enlightenment gave way to Romanticism, secular writers and poets began to borrow from mystical language. The dark night, once a symbol of the contemplative journey toward God, now entered poetry and philosophy as a metaphor for inner struggle, creativity, and transformation. Rainer Maria Rilke, the Austrian poet, often spoke of God's absence and the fertile void of the unknown. Søren Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher and Christian existentialist, explored the despair of the self before finding authenticity in surrender. Even Nietzsche, who declared God is dead, wrestled with a dark night of his own, a period of intense inner breakdown and philosophical rebirth. Though they didn't always use the phrase directly, their ideas were rooted in the same human experience, a collapse of certainty, a stripping away of identity, and a confrontation with the vast unknown. In the 20th century, the term dark night of the soul began appearing in unexpected places. Psychology. Enter Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist who revolutionized the understanding of the human psyche. Jung didn't just treat mental illness, he treated the soul. He saw individuation, or becoming one's true self, as a spiritual process, not just a mental one. He described a necessary encounter with the shadow that repressed, denied parts of ourselves. Jung never explicitly used the term dark night, but his concept of the night sea journey, the black sun, and ego death deeply echoes John of the Cross. There is no coming to consciousness without pain. Jung wrote, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul." By the mid-20th century, dark night of the soul had transcended its religious roots. It had become a cultural metaphor for any period of intense suffering, meaninglessness, or transformation. Authors like T.S. Eliot, The Wasteland, Joseph Campbell, The Hero with 1,000 Faces, Thomas Merton, a modern mystic and monk, Amabos, all explored the dark night as a central theme of the human condition. Movies, too, began reflecting this arc. Luke Skywalker facing the cave on Dagobah in Star Wars, Neo waking up in the real world in The Matrix, Frodo's despair in Mordor in The Lord of the Rings. Each journey follows the same path: fall, death, and eventual resurrection. The Dark Knight had become a universal archetype, yet with popularity comes distortion. Today, the term dark night of the soul is sometimes misused to describe mild depression, creative block, breakups, existential boredom. While all suffering is valid, John's original meaning was deeper. This wasn't just a bad day, it was the total deconstruction of one's spiritual identity. A true dark night dismantles the ego so that something sacred, eternal, and unknowable can take root. The darker the night, the closer the dawn, John would say. But not all darkness is the same. Part 3. Modern Interpretations, Awakening and the Dark Night. As the 20th century unfolded, Western seekers began turning their gaze eastward. The growing popularity of Eastern traditions, Zen Buddhism, Advaita Vedanta, Taoism, and Vipassana meditation offered new insights into the mind and spirit. Here, too, practitioners described periods of intense despair and disillusionment. In Zen, there's the concept of the Great Doubt, a deep existential unraveling that precedes enlightenment. In Vipassana, meditators often pass through the stage called Panga, where the illusion of self collapses. Though these systems didn't use the term dark night of the soul, their experiences echoed the same core: a collapse of the ego, a profound spiritual void, a reorientation toward truth. Teachers like Ramana Maharshi, J. Krishnamurti, and Chogyam Trungpa drew thousands of Western seekers, many of whom arrived chasing bliss, only to find they had to walk through darkness first. The 1960s and 70s saw an explosion of spiritual exploration. With it came a flood of New Age thought, blending mysticism, energy healing, channeling, astrology, and Eastern wisdom. But there was a problem. Much of it focused only on light, positivity, and manifestation. The shadow was being ignored. By the 1990s and 2000s, many spiritual teachers and psychologists began sounding the alarm, bypassing pain in favor of love, and light leads to superficial growth. Writers like Marianne Williamson, Eckhart Tolle, and Caroline Myss reintroduced the idea of spiritual crisis as a necessary step on the path. In fact, Eckhart Tolle's own awakening began with what could only be described as a dark night, a night where he wished for death, only to awaken into presence. In the 21st century, the phrase dark night of the soul began resurfacing, this time not just in monasteries, but in YouTube videos, TikToks, Reddit forums, and healing circles. Many people undergoing spiritual awakenings found themselves suddenly unable to function in everyday life, emotionally raw, anxious, or numb, disillusioned with materialism, questioning everything: identity, religion, purpose. Is this depression, or am I awakening? Why does the path to light feel like death? For many, discovering the term dark night of the soul became a lifeline. It gave their experience a name, a map, a lineage, and most importantly, validation. In spiritual circles, one powerful force is often connected to the dark night Kundalini. Kundalini is described as a dormant energy at the base of the spine. When awakened, it rises through the chakras, clearing out the body and psyche. Sounds beautiful, right? But what they don't tell you is, Kundalini can burn. It can tear apart your identity. It can lead to psychosis-like symptoms, energy surges, emotional outbursts, and physical pain. Many going through sudden Kundalini awakenings feel like they're dying, yet doctors find nothing wrong. What they are actually facing is a dark night of the soul triggered by spiritual energy. In Eastern traditions, this is sometimes called spiritual emergency. Pioneers like Stanislav Grof and Dr. Catherine Lucas began bridging the gap between psychology and mysticism, offering frameworks for understanding these crises as transformational, not pathological. In recent years, another layer has emerged in dark night discourse trauma. Many now recognize that the dark night often brings unresolved childhood wounds, ancestral patterns, and repressed pain to the surface. Why? Because the soul cannot awaken if it remains buried beneath unhealed grief, shame, or fear. This is where shadow work, inner child healing, and somatic therapy come in. Spiritual awakening isn't just about bliss, it's about integration. The night purifies not just your beliefs, it purges your pain. Your task is not to seek for love, Rumi once wrote, but merely to seek and find all the barriers within yourself that you have built against it. Many imagine the dark night as a one-time event, a descent, followed by a glorious awakening. But the reality is more cyclical. You may pass through multiple dark nights across your life, each one deeper, each one dismantling a new layer of illusion. These cycles aren't regressions, they are refinements. Like the seasons, spring brings growth, summer brings fullness, autumn brings release, winter brings silence and rest. The soul, too, moves through seasons, and each winter of the soul is a necessary prelude to greater light. Here, Centuries later, in the chaos of the modern world, the voice of a 16th century mystic still whispers, "To come to what you know not, you must go by a way in which you know not." Saint John of the Cross left more than poetry. He left a spiritual compass for anyone brave enough to walk the path of radical unknowing. Today's seekers are rediscovering his truth that the dark night is not punishment, it is purification. Not destruction, but divine preparation. Part 4. The Dark Night in the Modern World. A collective calling. Look around our world today. Economic collapse, war, climate change, loneliness in the digital age, meaninglessness in a sea of distractions. More and more people feel lost, anxious, and disconnected. And for many, the systems they once trusted, religion, politics, science, even self-help, no longer provide answers. What if we are not just in personal nights, but a collective dark night of the soul? Just as individuals undergo ego death to awaken spiritually, perhaps humanity is being stripped of its illusions, its comforts, its pride, so that something more true, compassionate, and interconnected can emerge. At this point, it's important to clarify, not every depression is a dark night of the soul. Not every trauma response is spiritual awakening. So how do you know the dark night has a sacred quality? A strange, quiet knowing that even in the pain, something deeper is being transformed. You're not just unraveling, you're being rewoven. Psychologist Scott Peck once wrote that mental illness is not just breakdown, it's often a sign of the soul's effort to heal itself. The same is true here. The dark night is a spiritual detox, and though it hurts, it leads to clarity, authenticity, and peace that isn't dependent on circumstance. What makes the dark night terrifying is not the absence of God, or truth, or love. It's the confrontation with ourselves, the masks we've worn, the identities we've clung to, the false light we've chased, the things we've numbed ourselves with. The night strips it all away, and in that terrifying stillness, a new question arises. Who am I really? When everything else is gone, those who endure the silence long enough eventually hear the whisper. You are not the image. You are not the performance. You are not your trauma or your achievements. You are that which watches all of it. You are the soul. So what comes after the dark night? Not fireworks, not perfection, not becoming some flawless spiritual master, but stillness, presence, humility, awe. You walk slower, you speak softer, you judge less, you trust more. You no longer seek to escape pain or chase highs. Instead, you become the one who holds space for yourself and for others. You live not from ego, but from essence. This is the gift of the dark night. Not that it makes you special, but that it returns you to what's real. If you are watching this and feel like your world is falling apart, if you feel abandoned by spirit, confused about your purpose, or numb to life itself, then perhaps this video has found you for a reason. You may not be broken. You may not be lost. You may simply be standing at the gates of transformation. The dark night of the soul is not the end. It is the beginning of a new inner world, one not built on illusion, but on truth, silence, and the sacred fire of awakening. You are not alone in this night. Thousands across the planet are walking this same invisible path, and when the sun rises again, you will not be who you were. You will be reborn.